Stop messing around, stop fooling around, stop delaying, stop procrastinating. Get up, get out, get it done. Everything is possible, nothing is a problem, and anything can be overcome. I just get my ass up out of bed, I get my shit together, and I get out and I start the fight. And that will transform you from a mere mortal into a superhuman being. I've never, ever, ever met anybody who told me that they got rich watching their IRA or their 401k.
All right, welcome back to the Daily Cash Flow. Peter, happy Thursday. How's it going?
George.
Want to just get into it today? Anything you want to touch on before we hop in?
I'm indoors today like we've all been because of the weird smoke from the wildfires.
Yeah, it's like Blade Runner out there yesterday. Yeah.
Apocalyptic of sorts.
Very much.
It just seems like just when you feel like you've gotten over the drama of the week, like there's another thing that happens that you've never before experienced that really impacts you and everybody else. Yeah. And it's like, I just feel it's like an unraveling of sorts. But
my friends in New York were all everyone was posting pictures of it. But
I was in New York City yesterday. There were people eating lunch outside of expensive restaurants on the sidewalk.
That's amazing.
In suits and ties and all of that. I found that to be weird.
Yeah.
The number of people rocking their vapes and their blunts and cigarettes was unbelievable.
Yeah, not enough smoke in the air. You got to add it.
I found all of that just to be really interesting to see visually because, like it was so bad in Manhattan yesterday that you just had to be indoors. But people were like, outside having lunch.
No, I know. Even in Asbury, I think my one friend was saying there was a bunch of people running on the boardwalk, and it's interesting how some people just can't be stopped.
They can't be stopped.
Yeah, New York is difficult because it made me think a lot about pandemic because you're on the island, you're locked in, and there's only so much you can do. So even though I personally wouldn't be eating on the sidewalk, but at the same time, you can't like get out super easily and find somewhere, especially with this the smog was all over the East Coast. So
similar decision-making process about leaving the house and wearing a mask during COVID.
Yeah.
Some people were like, no mask, screw you, I'm going outside, I don't care. And other people obviously were very inspired to wear masks and mask up. It's amazing to me to see how every day of our lives continues to be evidence of two sides of the same coin and divisiveness and bipartisanship in the classic definition of the word, but also just sort of in a daily lifestyle.
I'm glad you brought that up in that way because that actually leads us into our first topic, which is like you hear all the time about, the world is overpopulated. We have too many people. We're burdening the planet. Environmental.
That's been what we've been hearing forever, for decades,
forever. And then I feel like in the last 3 years, particularly, it's been kind of rumbling that we are in a population crisis, and that the U.S. in particular. So this is the figure that I wanted to mention: that there were about 3.66 million babies born in the U.S. last year. That's a decline of 15% since 2007. Basically, people are saying that the U.S. is reaching this point where we're not going to be able to replace the population. And economists are worried that fewer births will put greater pressure on the labor market, labor supply in the next decade. Japan and South Korea, are even in far worse shape. There are many theories to this, but basically I wanted to ask you, what's your take on this? Have you heard about this? Have you thought about this?
I've heard about it, and you and I have spoken about this, I think, a couple of years ago in one of our episodes that we did perhaps in 2021.
Yeah.
And what we picked up on was the first of what's now been multiple years of data. But that was, I think, the first year where the data came out and said that there was, for the first time in decades, in a century, there was less babies born than there were people dying. And that indicated a potential peak or plateau in global population trends. And we had never really digested that data before or really had to contemplate what that meant. Because forever, as you've already pointed out, we've all been speaking about how overpopulated we are and how much of a drain on our natural resources this is causing, and where is everybody going to go, and there's no housing and there's no food and the whole thing. And now here we are talking about multiple years worth of data where the population has peaked, plateaued, or in this case declined.
Yeah.
It's a big deal. You think AI is going to impact labor markets and our ability to earn money and provide for our families? How about the fact that there just aren't going to be enough people around to fill jobs and do other things that are necessary and fill schools and fill military requirements and so on and so forth? That's going to be a real issue. I think it's going to only exacerbate an inflationary environment in the labor markets because without lots of new people coming into the labor pool year after year after year, decade after decade, it's going to mean that there's less supply, which means that in the case if demand for labor stays flat or increases, there's going to have to be increased wages. So in order to attract people into the labor pools, you're going to have to give them a lot. Training, school, education, a lot of money, a lot of benefits, because otherwise they're going to have their pick because they're going to be in high demand. Perhaps we're seeing some of that now in this post-pandemic, really weird labor environment that we're in, like the recession, but with a strong labor market. We've never seen it before. So look, supply and demand with everything. If the amount of labor supply decreases and demand stays flat or increases, we're going to see huge wage increases for labor pools across all different job sectors, industries, and price points. And it's going to be a big deal. And it's going to happen very gradually and very continually over time if the births continue to be less than the deaths. Simple math. Are more people being born than are dying? Yes or no? Because if no, we're going to have shortages of population.
Yeah, the AI of it all is interesting to me, and that reminds me of, I think it's Fritz Haber, and or I've said before on this podcast how
this is where Smart George comes in.
No, but I've said about how around this time, it's reminding me a lot of pre-World War I era. And around that time, food was really short, that they were going through famine kind of across the world because fertilizer was scarce and, food wasn't being grown. And so this guy, Fritz Haber, came up with the Fritz Haber process, which basically creates ammonia, synthetic ammonia, which is used in, I think a third of fertilizer nowadays. And so it saved the world. And so that's what makes me think of is like, oh, AI is maybe kind of like the Fritz Haber process. Maybe that's going to be able to fill this gap of labor shortage that we have. On the other hand, the one thing it makes me think of is Fritz Haber also developed like chlorine and chemical weapon, warfare in World War I. Right. And so it reminds me kind of the AI.
It's like the Monsanto of the pre-war era.
Right. And so could it be the same thing that it saves the world, but it also is incredibly dangerous? And so I feel like that's what this whole thing reminds me of right now.
It reminds me of that as well.
Following the SVB collapse in March, there were reports of a bunch of different sectors talking about tighter lending practices, leading to difficult challenges for small businesses, developers in general.
Yeah.
What are you seeing in your industry? How are you handling it? What are your thoughts on this kind of bank tightening up process?
So first of all, the small businesses are mostly impacted by the regional banks and the regional lenders. That's where these small businesses bank. Mm-hmm. And the regional lenders and banks have tightened up their loan practices. They're not doing these loans anymore. And for whatever loans they are doing, they're only doing them for the best customers, the most longstanding customers who have deposit relationships and product relationships with the bank already. They're not taking on any new people, new customers for these loans. Construction lending is facilitated nationwide by local and regional banks. That's who provides developers with the construction financing. Those loans have really dried up and gotten very expensive and prohibitive cost-wise, not only because of interest rates, because the banks are tightening their loan to cost, their loan to value, their personal guarantee requirements, their underwriting requirements. I mean, all of that stuff has just gotten tougher. So before, when you had to have a certain net worth and a certain amount of experience and a certain track record to go ahead and get a construction loan from a bank to develop your project, now you have to have a higher net worth, and you have to jump through more hoops. It's really knocked a lot of would-be developers off the table right now in this environment, so that's tough. This is like the normal cycle, though. Like every time there's some sort of banking thing, it's tighten the regulations, and then we have some period of time where those regulations were in place, and then perhaps we roll some of them back, perhaps we don't, perhaps it's only for the big mega banks, and maybe it's for the local regionals and other types of rules that were set forth that get rolled back. At the end of the day, to me, it's a funny question, because do the heightened regulations and increased regulatory environment and restrictions really have the impact that we think or want them to have? Because it's such a cycle. Where's the long-term permanent corrective result? Like, how come we don't get a result that lasts as a result of regulation, and it lasts forever, and that thing never happens again? Like, it seems like every economic cycle brings fractured banks, banking problems, lending problems, tighter underwriting now because we gave loans too easily. Man, we've seen this movie before.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just wonder what good these regulations end up doing. And sure, you need to be able to reasonably regulate very important things like our banking industry and, these things that touch everybody's lives. Like we all share a common thread to the banking industry. Like it should be stable and strong and not so vulnerable. But it seems like, I don't know, where are these regulations having this permanent impact? Because I don't really see it right now.
Yeah.
And I know that some out there would say, oh, well, in 2016, the Trump administration rolled back a lot of the requirements for local and regional lenders. Okay, like that happened. But, again, in the cycle, the economic cycle that we see decade after decade after decade, because it's about 8 to 11 years. In this case, maybe it was 12 years, 13 years. Where is the permanent result that just stays and is sticky and just doesn't repeat itself? I'm not seeing it.
Yeah.
And I wonder what good these banking regulations and restrictions really end up having, because consumers seem to get hosed every cycle anyway.
Yeah, before we started filming, you mentioned the kind of the comparison of banking to like the tech sector like this. Some people are reflecting on the volatility of banking being similar to that almost.
George, if you pull up the banking stock index and look at the returns that investing in bank stocks would have given you as an investor, for decades, it was like 15%, right? It had a certain amount of risk. Not much. It was banking, and the returns were like 15%. Now, if you look at the returns of the banking sector and compare them to, say, technology, right? Technology is supposed to have a lot of volatility and a lot of return.
Right.
Banking's supposed to have a low volatility and a lower return. So right now, you've got the banking sector with, instead of a 15% return, offering about a 10% return, and the volatility in the banks is way higher than it's ever been. So you've got technology-like volatility with lower than typical banking returns.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. George, if I want the high volatility, I'll go to crypto, I'll go to tech, I'll go to burgeoning technologies, I'll go to developing countries. But to put my money in U.S. bank stocks with the amount of volatility that they have and their returns that they're offering, it's out of whack. Remember, risk versus reward. There's not a corresponding amount of reward for taking on the risk in bank stocks. For me right now, that's how I see it. For me, it's a hard pass.
State Farm and Allstate insurance companies stopped selling new home policies in California.
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah, citing...
Didn't we just talk about that with Florida?
I think Florida and Louisiana have been going through this for the last couple of years, I think, with the hurricane seasons and whatnot. I think
these insurers are pulling out.
Right. Yeah.
They're pulling out.
So in this situation, it's not hurricane, it's wildfires that are the reason that are being given, but also the state regulation not allowing them to raise premiums. As
the
a result
regulatory
of
environment.
wildfires. Yeah. So what does this signal to you about the future of private insurance in these states? Because a lot of these people are now being forced to just go to state insurance.
Signals so many things to me. First of all, you're saying that it wasn't just the wildfires in California where the insurers said, oh, we don't want to insure. It was the regulatory environment within the state that made it impossible to do business, or way less desirable to do business, and they finally said, screw it. We'll just go somewhere else. We'll pull out. This is what we're seeing. This is what's happening. I don't know how these states and other places expect to balance budgets and earn the money they need to make to pay their staff, to pay the administration, to pay for public services and amenities. Like it's just getting harder and harder. And we talk about how these states don't have any money and they all need the money because they all have these big agendas and budget goals that they want to achieve between schools and roads and infrastructure and homelessness and healthcare. I mean, the whole thing. You need to have the insurance companies be able to do business in your state. You need to be able to tax them fairly. They need to be able to do a bunch of business and make a bunch of money. The consumers need more options. It's bad for consumers when insurers pull out of the market because now consumers have fewer options. What happens? The price goes way up. We saw it in Florida. We're seeing it in Louisiana. So it's just not great for anybody. It's not great for the state. It's not great for the consumers. George, when I go out to look for a policy for my home or for a building, I want to be able to take it to as many markets as I can. I want to be able to take it to 6 or 8 different carriers, get it priced out, and see what my options are that are good for me within my budget and price point and for the amount of coverage and limits and deductible and all the other things that I'm looking for. If I don't have 6 or 8 markets to go to, and now I have 1 or 2, which is what Florida is now. There's 1 or 2 or maybe 3 insurance providers if you're a homeowner in Florida.
Which is so crazy.
Like if I only have 1 or 2 or at most 3, there's no options. Now they're dictating to me price. Now they're dictating to me while I'm paying the high price, I get a low value. because go find another. You don't like it, Peter? Go find another deal. Go get it quoted. And I'll be like, okay, I'll go get it quoted. And then the next day I'll call him back and say, okay, I'll take your shitty deal because I couldn't get it quoted. There was no other option for me. So I don't like it for the consumers. I don't like it from the standpoint of the inflation that it puts on pricing, because with fewer options, up goes pricing. And I don't love it for the states and the governments and the municipalities. They all need money. They need to find ways to generate money, not find ways to lose money. I don't know, man. It seems like all of these places are finding ways to lose money every single day. They stop the development. They drive out the insurance companies. We're talking about California right now. LA, we recently spoke about the mansion tax and how that was supposed to generate $56 million a month. And the market's just stopped. It stopped. And you want to know what else I've recently learned? That $56 million a month that they thought that they were going to generate by imposing this mansion tax, it's generated $3 million for the month.
That's a huge margin.
So I don't know where that miss gets analyzed and someone says, geez, we got this wrong. Like maybe we should look at this. Are they doing that? No. So you've got a budget gap now of $53 million. They thought they were going to get 56 out of this policy. They got 3. And that's just 1 month. So it's 53 times 12. You're talking about a lot of money. You're talking about $620 million that they're short because the policy didn't generate what it was supposed to. So the insurance companies pulling out of California, you know, it's tough for the California consumers. They need more options. They're getting fewer because the insurance companies pulled out. It's tough to do business in California. This is why the billionaires and millionaires are leaving California, because it's too tough. It's too tough. They're too heavily taxed. It's too restrictive. The companies are leaving. That's why the companies left Illinois and New York and California, and they're going to these other places down south where they're more welcome, where there's less regulations. It's just the continuation of the same thing. I'm not shocked by it. I just think it's poor business. I think it's very poor policy. And I don't know how these legislators can continue to go on and institute such poor policy. I mean, at some point, the rubber has to hit the road.
Yeah. On a similar note, last June, we talked about Houston and, you know, their housing first policy with treating homelessness.
Yes, I remember. Great policy.
How successful they've been with that. Recent news in California seems to point to the opposite scenario, where $17 billion has been spent on homelessness, and basically it's just, you know, rampant all through the state.
So give me the number again. $17 billion.
$17 billion
has been spent.
On
I remember speaking with someone the other day that there's 115,000 homeless people that they've counted.
Right.
Who knows how accurate that is, but they're saying 115,000 homeless people in the state of California. So if I do some quick math, 17 billion divided by 115,000 is $148,000 per homeless person. To me, that doesn't sound like enough, which is crazy to think, because you hear at first 17 billion.
Sounds like a lot.
Sounds like a ton.
Yeah.
And it hasn't moved the needle in California. But then you break it down on a per person basis and you see that it's 148,000. And you're like, well, we recently spoke about how housing costs about 280 or 300,000 a unit to build. So you can't build a unit of housing for homeless for 148,000.
Right.
And then, you know, you need all the other infrastructure you need: mental health, physical health, staffing, professionals, administration, food, career training. Like all of that stuff, I think, is part of any reasonable solution to homelessness.
Absolutely.
And certainly that can't be done with 148,000 per person. So in California's defense, I think that, 17 billion, it's probably not enough, which really sucks, because now they're going to have to throw a whole lot more money at probably 3 or 4x of 17 more at the problem, which is really horrible to hear, because we just talked about how all these businesses and people are leaving, how they're missing their revenue budgets. The San Francisco, the office buildings are vacant. They're not collecting taxes. A dozen examples of why the money just isn't available in California to address all these things. That part's really sad. But really the sad part is that there's 115,000 homeless people that need services and assistance and housing. And they're likely not going to get it anytime soon, because if 17 billion wasn't enough and you really need like 65 billion, I don't know where they're going to come up with the other, 50 billion. That's the first thing. You can't do anything for people unless you have money. George, in my house, I can't do anything for my family unless I can afford to do it, right? So even at an extreme personal micro level, I have to have the money first, and then I can solve the problem. I feel fine and confident and able if I can afford to solve my problem with my kid who needs medical attention. And if I can't afford it, then I feel this instability. And I think it's got to be the same for what we're talking about in these states and municipalities that are getting criticized for worrying about money first, and it's really a people problem. Listen, the people are going to have more problems if the money isn't there. George, nothing happens unless the cash register rings. It's business 101. It's humanity and socioeconomics 101. You have to be able to pay for it in order to do it. You know, and without the money there, it's just not going to be possible. And California has a lack of money right now, big time, for all these things that we're talking about. I am very worried for them. And I'm worried for these 115,000 homeless people. We've all seen the media footage, and perhaps even have ourselves driven through or walked through some of these areas in LA and San Francisco. It's crazy, man.
Yeah.
It's really, it's heartbreaking. And it's so difficult to think that this is our country and the state of California in 2023. We're the most powerful, wealthy in the planet. We've got all these capabilities. We can accomplish so much. But yet, look at this, 115,000 people on the streets that need so much more than just housing. Yeah. Housing first, but so much more than just the housing. And the state of California can't give it to them for $148,000 a person. They can't. If it were 10,000 homeless people, then the 17 billion would be fine. Yeah. But it's 115,000 homeless people, and the 17 billion isn't enough. So I think they're going to need 65 billion.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're going to need another almost $50 billion. I don't know where they're going to get it from.
Yeah. The last time I was out in LA was 2020, and it was bad then. And by all accounts, it's gotten much worse. Yeah. The thing that stands out to me is that I reread through that Houston piece from last June, and in that particular situation, everyone seems to be playing well together, meaning that the public sector is playing well with the private sector. They're having developers partner with governors and all these kinds of things, as opposed to in California right now, it really seems everything is highly politicized to a point where local leaders are blaming the state leaders, and the state leaders are blaming local leaders, and basically no one's taking responsibility.
Well, that's what happens on sinking ships. Yeah. But believe me, Texas is politicized as well. Let's not paint the picture that Texas is not a divisive, politically charged environment. It certainly is.
Of course.
But you're right. There's more harmony. The policy seems to be inspiring people to work together rather than run to their different side of the ring and point fingers.
Yeah.
And look at just the result in Houston with the housing first policy. It could be better, but it's worked. In fact, it's the best example of policy that's worked in our country for homelessness that we've ever seen. So it seems to me that there's some credibility to be able to point at Houston and be like, all right, let's see what we can learn from this.
Yeah, well, I think you brought up the political heat of that area. I think that actually, in fact, it bolsters their argument for what they're doing. And that, clearly Texas has a lot of things that people are not agreeing on and people are constantly fighting about. So the fact that they can at least agree on this means that something's working.
Tough times in California. And I don't mean to harp on California. I love going to visit California. I've got dear friends and family in California. And it seems like every week when we speak, George, we're talking about something regarding California, and we're here on the East Coast. So I don't mean to be bringing up California all the time. I think we're doing that, but it's not without good reason.
A new study found that averaged multifamily projects in LA took almost full 4 years from.
We're talking about California again.
We're talking about California again. So we can move on if you want to, but this is something that
let's hear it. Let's
our California
pile
blog.
On and beat the shit out of them.
Yeah. So how does this stack up to the rest of the country as far as how long it takes from application to completion? What should developers know?
It's a long time. The biggest amount of lag time that a developer experiences is always the permitting and application process. The construction process is really known and quantifiable. We know that once we have permits, it takes a certain amount of time per acre to do site work. It takes a certain amount of time to lay a foundation and a certain amount of time to frame, get a roof on. We know the lead time for windows. We know the lead time for siding material and roofing material. So all that stuff can be reverse engineered onto a Gantt chart, and we can figure out the time it's going to take. What we have no control over, what we have no idea about how long it's going to take, is the zoning, technical review, planning process, the political process, the permitting process. It's a lot. And especially in an area like California, it's got a huge government infrastructure. It's got a lot of different people overseeing a bunch of different aspects of development. It just takes a long time, too long, in my opinion. Look, it should take 3-4 months by the time a developer submits a set of plans, get a technical review comment back, get the planning and development comment back, get the city council and government's comments, have a corrective meeting after the fact. Maybe the developer has to revise a few things. Maybe it has to tweak a few things. Go ahead and do that. Bring them back to a second meeting. God forbid that's not enough. A third meeting should be it. You're talking 3 months because they all meet once a month.
Yeah.
It should be coordinated. It should be synced. All of those different departments, construction, zoning, planning, technical, city government, they should all coordinate and talk to each other. And it should be a 90-day process, a 3-month process from the time that the application is made. Mm-hmm. And then you should either get your permits or not get your permits. But to have multiple meetings, 8 meetings, 9 meetings, you're talking 8 or 9 months. And that's if you don't have to skip a month, because often they don't meet during holidays, or often someone's sick, or you don't have a quorum, so you can't meet, so you have to skip a month. So usually if it's 8 or 9, you're talking about really over a year. It shouldn't take over a year. And my God, sometimes it goes a year and a half, 2 years. It just shouldn't take that long. We have that here in New Jersey. It's awful. California's pretty bad from what I understand, so I'm not shocked to hear what you're saying. New York, I mean, forget about it. So these places, again, these blue states, it's like, I don't get where the regulatory environment that's restrictive and all this oversight, and we're protecting the consumer and we're protecting the residents. I don't see where the protections are. Like, just make your process more efficient, make it better. If I were in government as a private business, like, it wasn't a public sector thing, it was just all privatized magically somehow. Like, I would seek the best. I would have it be the most efficient. I'd make it go very fast. I wouldn't want fat. I wouldn't want excess. I wouldn't want lag and drag. I mean, that's how I run business. Why wouldn't government want to run the same way? George, I just don't get how these towns and states can flub it like this. It takes so long to do something that you would think would be so simple. Even within these highly restrictive, long delay states, there's towns and areas that seem to get it right more than others. And it's amazing why we can't look to them and learn and replicate throughout the entire state. And it's amazing to me that this kind of thing even exists at all. These towns need the developers and entrepreneurs to come in and take risk and build and create business and create infrastructure and create housing and create opportunity and have the jobs come and have the taxes come and have the rate of, like, they need it. That's their job, man. These governments, these leaders, they have to create that stuff. And it seems like all they're doing is squashing it in a lot of cases. California, God bless. I wish you luck, but I can't do business there. You're uninvestable to me.
All right, we're done with California for today, at least.
You promise?
I promise. I mean, I'm not going to bring it up.
You can't go a week without bringing it up again.
We'll see. It's possible. One thing I do want to talk about is we did 2 pieces. We did a piece on the kind of electric vehicles and then Occidental. And both those pieces, man, people have some strong feelings about the environment and about, fuel and all that kind of stuff. According to our World in Data, the transportation sector accounts for 24% of global emissions, CO2 emissions particularly. But there's these synthetic fuels that are being proposed as kind of carbon neutral options for kind of traditional road vehicles and aircraft.
Yeah.
As a business owner, how do you balance things like this? Like, how do you balance kind of environmental impact with profitability and the responsibility with other considerations?
Well, we see the world moving in the direction of electronic vehicles. We see the discussions happening already about alternative fuels. You're pointing it out again right now. We've spoken recently about, hey, what are gas stations going to do? They're going to have to pivot. They're going to have to figure out how to survive in an economic environment where there's less demand for people to pull in and fill up with fuel. Maybe they're going to have to make capital improvements and invest in electric charging stations. I can see, in addition to electric charging stations, they're going to pivot and install e-fuel capability, the synthetic fuel that you're now suggesting. And of course, all these fossil fuel companies and the oil companies are going to be heavily invested in providing those synthetic fuels, because if people aren't going to buy the gas and petroleum from them, they're sure as hell going to buy the synthetic alternative from them. Because I promise you, the one thing that's not going to happen is that these fossil fuel businesses and Exxon and Occidental, they're not going out of business. Mm-hmm. They're not going away. So they're going to be selling us either electricity, or they're going to be selling us gas for the moment, or they're going to be selling us synthetic fuel, or whatever they're going to be selling us, but we're going to be buying it from them. It's going to be a capital-intensive proposition for these gas stations. So if you're a gas station owner, just save your money and have access to capital, because you're going to have to make investments in technology and equipment and upgrades to your gas stations.
If you like what you just heard, you can subscribe to The Daily Cash Flow on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And we'd love it if you left us a comment or review. You can follow us on TikTok and Twitter at SiegelCap, and on Instagram at Siegel.cap. As always, if you're an accredited investor, go to SiegelCapital.com and take our survey to see if you qualify to take part in one of our apartment building deals. That's SIEGEL Capital.com.